As Anna just mentioned, my name is Roger, and welcome all to Coding 101, the second installment of JavaScript. So just so you know, we did do a previous, this is going to be a series of JavaScript courses, so definitely stay tuned. We did one session just 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we're going to continue doing some sessions. So yeah, just so you know that we're doing that those sessions. Before further ado, let's do some introductions. So I'll introduce first of all, CodeUp. CodeUp is an international tech school that was created for women, trans, and non-gender conforming people who are passionate about doing meaningful things. We're a community, and one of the things that we like as a community is sharing knowledge, sharing our passion for new technologies, including JavaScript. And this webinar is effectively the result of that. It's our passion to share knowledges. Now, CodeUp is doing a whole lot of webinars and courses, so definitely check it out on the website. You can find all the information. Or after today's webinar, feel free to ask myself or Anna for if you need any help. But as I said, you'll find all the resources online for you. I'll let Anna introduce herself. About me. My name is Roger. I'm originally from Barcelona, and I have about 10 years of experience in the digital space. Across England, Australia, and India, and also in Spain, and in roles such as product owner and also heading up software development teams. Now, one of the things I really want to stress out about my profile is I do not have a tech background. So I do not come from a computer science background or graduate. I say that important because even though some people earlier mentioned that they have knowledge about some, programming skills and so on, I really want to say one thing is that I get it. I know that JavaScript and coding in general might be daunting. Trust me, it's within your reach. It's definitely within your fingertips, and it's easier than it seems. So don't panic and don't stress about, breaking the ice. We've all been through there, and trust me, it's a learning curve that is steep, but it's definitely very rewarding. So Anna, do you want to tell us about yourself?
Yeah, so basically I'm also someone that didn't come from a technical background, but then learned to code by doing a boot camp. Then I worked as a front-end developer in a company. So that means I was using JavaScript, I was using React and Vue, which are dialects of the JavaScript language. And then basically I joined the CodeUp team because I wanted to pass on the skills that I had learned to other people. So I'm part of the team. I do various different things, along which teaching assistant. So yeah, I'm here just to support, and I hope you guys enjoy this workshop.
Good stuff. So that's about interactions. Really like to hear from you. So during the next couple of minutes whilst we finish the introductions, if you want to tell us about what sort of project would you like to build with your coding skills? Someone mentioned earlier that they were trying to build an app and so on. So if you've got any ideas, we would love to hear them just out of curiosity. You might want to build your own portfolio. You might want to build, a web app, or you might want to build an online shop. So any of that, just drop it in the chat, and that would be awesome. I'll take the opportunity to mention that if there's any questions during the session, if they're related to this webinar, please just ping a note on the chat, and we'll address them. And then we can just navigate together throughout the slides. Okay. So that's that. Today, what we'll do is, as I mentioned, this is a series of JavaScript webinars. So I'll do a bit of a quick recap, and then we'll do a presentation. So I'll walk you through. I'll do a bit of a crash course of the content of the previous webinars, so you really have to speed to follow today's session. And then we'll do an activity together, and then at the end we'll have some time to do some Q&A together. So any questions that you have, we can also address them after. Okay. So today, let's talk JavaScript. So before we talk about JavaScript, I would like for all of us to understand what happens when you load effectively a website. Okay, so if you go to google.com or any website that you effectively access, there's effectively 3 things that happen. And you'll see in a second why I'm saying this. I want to introduce you to JavaScript, and to do so, I want you to understand that JavaScript is in the wall of the website. So we'll talk about what happens when you effectively load a website. Okay, so when you access a website, all what you're doing is your computer through your browser. So say Google Chrome, Safari, Edge, Internet Explorer, whatever Opera, whatever browser that you use, or what your browser is doing is accessing a file in someone's computer. So there's a thing called a server where there's a file that is saved, right? And your browser looks for that file in a specific address, thanks to the address that you put in your browser, right? That file, say for example, google.com, has a set of instructions. So you give instructions. This file has a roadmap and instructions for the browser, and the browser knows to interpret those instructions, right? Now, these instructions are effectively written in 3 different languages, so to speak, or in 3 different ways, right? These 3 ways together define the website that you see in your screen, okay? So what are these 3 sets of instructions? The first one is HTML, right? Some mentioned earlier that know about the HTML. So HTML is a set of instructions that define one side of a website, and that's effectively the content and the layout. So the website, whether you have 2 images, for example, whether, let's say you wanted to write your own profile, right? So you put Roger and then 1 paragraph about information about yourself and then an image about you, right? So the instructions for the browser would be, with HTML, I'm going to define that I want the image to be on the left and the text to be on the right, right? And then a headline that just effectively over the top. I give the instructions about the layout, the structure, the skeleton of the website, right? These are the instructions that are given to the browser to render, to display the website, and effectively the skeleton of the website, right? Now, the second set of instructions that the browser gets are what's called CSS, right? CSS takes care of effectively anything that has to do with presentation, with the way something is displayed, the way something is visualized. So things that CSS handle are the font size, for example, the colors, the background color that you put, anything that has to do with cosmetic changes, anything that has to do with presentation, the type of font that you use, whether you want it to be italics, whether you want something in bold, those instructions are given to the browser on CSS, right? Which is also another set of instructions. So as you see, HTML and CSS go hand in hand, they work together, right? Now I want to say you don't need to know HTML and CSS for the purpose of today's webinar. This is as far as we'll go when it comes to these 2, but it's important that you understand that browsers do read and do interpret websites with those 2 languages. The third set of instructions is effectively what we're going to be talking about today, is JavaScript, okay? JavaScript handles anything that has to do with interaction. So when you're on a website and you click on something, if you're doing online shopping, for example, and you add a product on a basket, that's handled with JavaScript. If you go to a website and there's a contact us form and you put your name and then a message and then you click submit, that's also handled with JavaScript, right? So anything that has to do with interaction, the way you yourself interact with the website, all of that is going to be mediated, at least, if not fully delivered, by JavaScript, okay? Now, I don't know if there's any questions at that stage, but the key takeaway from this slide is understand that JavaScript lives in an ecosystem where HTML, CSS, and JavaScript effectively go hand in hand. The result of these instructions, HTML instructions, CSS, and JavaScript instructions, is effectively what you see on the website, okay? Now, one last thing about JavaScript. JavaScript has evolved a lot since it was created and has many purposes. For the purpose of today's webinar, we're going to be talking about JavaScript when it comes to its web development use, okay? There's other uses for JavaScript, but for the purpose of this webinar, it's going to be just on website and handling the interaction of a website, okay? If there are any questions, please just drop a note on the chat, but otherwise I'll just keep pressing on, okay? So easy peasy thus far, okay? Now, something that is almost the alphabet or a key aspect about JavaScript that we discussed in the previous webinar is what's called a JavaScript variable, right? Now, a JavaScript variable is, as I mentioned earlier, an alphabet is one of the key aspects that you need to understand about JavaScript. It's effectively one of the key mechanisms that you as a programmer have to give instructions to JavaScript, right? So as we mentioned earlier, JavaScript is nothing but a set of instructions for the browser. So one of the key instructions that you need to know to JavaScript is what's called a JavaScript variable, okay? Now, what's a JavaScript variable? Really, conceptually, JavaScript is a box, okay? It's a box that has a unique name and is a box with a unique name where you store data in it, okay? So let me ask you, give you an example. When you move out of an old apartment, or if you're moving into a new apartment, into a new house, you typically arrange your things, right? You put all your belongings in boxes. You put your shoes, for example, in a box. You put your clothes in a box, and then you put your books in a box, right? So each of these boxes would effectively be a different variable. As you see, it's a box that has a unique name. You do not have two boxes with the same name because you want to find the right your belongings, and each of them is used to store information in it. Okay, so variables are important because when we store information in them, it helps us to give instructions to JavaScript, manipulate, store, and manipulate data. Okay, now this is obviously just text and just an icon. Let's see how do you actually create a JavaScript variable in JavaScript. So to create a JavaScript variable, JavaScript uses what is called keywords. So specific words that you know JavaScript knows how to react with, right? Or what to do with it. The first keyword that you use, and these keywords are effectively, again, specific words that JavaScript understands what to do with it, is you use the keyword let. That's L-E-T, right? With that, you're telling JavaScript, hey, JavaScript, heads up, because I'm going to create a JavaScript variable, okay? So just let, lowercase, then you put space, and then you put a unique name. So effectively the name of your box, right? So in this case, it could be shoes, right? Again, let space shoes, right? With that, we've told JavaScript and the browser, I'm going to be storing some information here, and this is going to be a unique box. So get ready, okay? Now, how do I store information in this box? Is through the use of a symbol that might look familiar, which is called assignment, okay? Now, really heads up here. I know that this symbol, this is the equal symbol in mathematics, but be really wary, be really mindful, excuse me, because what this symbol in JavaScript means is not equal. It's actually saying, I'm gonna store in this box whatever information is on the right-hand side, okay? And what's on the right-hand side, in this case, is gonna be boots, right? A text boots, okay? So to create a JavaScript variable is effectively a way to store and manipulate data. You'll see later why we use variables in action, but you use the keyword let space a unique name. So in this case, shoes, assignment symbol, and then on the right-hand side, we put whatever content we want to put inside this variable. In this case is boots, okay? Now in JavaScript, we use these double quotes, as you see, double quotes, boots, double quote. This is just to say to JavaScript that this is text, okay? So this is just another instruction that you give to JavaScript. Anything that you place between two double quotes is automatically considered to JavaScript as text. It could be anything you want. JavaScript will pretty much ignore that. Just be plain text for you, okay? I don't know if there are any questions at this stage.
Nope, no questions have been left in the chat, but if you guys have questions, just leave them in the chat.
Cool. So that's an example of, that's also something that we saw in the past. So that's how we create variables. Now, what can we store in these variables? Well, many things. And trust me, we could do 10 webinars just talking about the examples of things that we could do. A couple of examples that we talked about were two types of data that we talked about. One was what's called strings. So don't worry about too much about this word. This is just nothing but text. So here on the right-hand side, you see two examples, right, of variables. As I mentioned earlier, note that the double quotes that you place, you're just telling JavaScript that that's text, okay? So that in the JavaScript world is called string, but it's nothing but text, just like the one you would include in an email, just that we need to put in these double quotes, okay? So I put a couple of examples there. And obviously the other example that we saw is numbers, right? So notice that we don't use the double quotes here because it's just a number. So we just put 25 in this case, and then decimals, just like you would do in mathematics. So radius here would be 0.55, and that would effectively be storing that information in the variable, okay? So pretty straightforward. That's in essence what we talked about in the previous webinar. I mean, we went into a bit more detail, but that's the gist of it. Now, what I would like for us to do is to see the environment that we're going to be using these variables on. Now, Anna has just shared with you in the chat a link to a CodePen. Now, CodePen, and I'll walk you through it, is effectively where we're going to be doing some magic. It's effectively what you see in the screen right now. Now, I know you're going to see a lot of screens. Don't worry too much about it. I'll give you a couple of seconds to make sure that CodePen loads. Whilst it's loading for everybody, what is CodePen? CodePen is a platform that allows you to code HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and see what's the result of that, right? So remember earlier that we talked about that any website is the result of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript instructions. So CodePen allows us to really see that. So if you have your page loaded, what you have is you see a set of screens, right? A set of boxes. So you see on the left-hand side that there's a title HTML. So you can guess that what's inside that box is effectively HTML instructions, right? Middle CSS, and then on the right-hand side, we have some JavaScript already, okay? And then the combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is effectively what you see at the bottom. So if you see this title here, hi, my name is Sarah, and so on, and then this image, that's effectively the result of the code that we have inputted above, right? When you become more advanced in programming, you will not be using this interface, but just for the beginning, it really helps you to see, you know, and to touch code very easily, okay? So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna minimize this window. So if you actually click on this and you drag it onto the left, you'll see that this text sort of resizes the length of the sentence. Don't worry too much about it. That just doesn't affect anything. And we're gonna close it because we're gonna close the HTML window because we're not gonna be doing HTML today. And same for CSS, right? So you see here, we can just minimize all of these to the left, right? And then here we're gonna have the JavaScript. And then what we can do here is that one we can also minimize it, right? So we can just minimize it, right? So again, I'm just going to do it again. We had this at the beginning, right? We're just going to minimize that. You see that these changes, don't worry about the resizing of the sentences. This stays what it is. It's just that, so it's not on the way. So we can concentrate on JavaScript, okay? And then we're going to sort of also scroll this down, okay? Now, what you see here is the environment. This is the code where we left it off the previous in the previous webinar. So you see here some examples of variables that we've created, both strings, so text, and also numbers. And then we created a sentence and so on. Now, what you see at the top with that is in gray is nothing but comments. So if you put this double symbol at the beginning of a sentence, it just tells JavaScript you can ignore it. It's just a comment. You could write here whatever you want. It's just a comment. Right, so just so you know. Okay, so we're gonna come back to this. We're gonna do some funky JavaScript here in a second. Before we do that, I would like to introduce to you a couple of interesting concepts on JavaScript in addition to that. If there's any questions, please let me know on this. Again, we just created here some text, some numbers, and this is just a subtraction, right? So we're subtracting this number from this number. That's it. So unless there's any questions, I'll just go back to the slides. I promise there's only a couple of slides. I'll introduce you to a couple of new concepts, and we're going to come back here and then start doing some code together. Does that sound okay with everybody? Unless there's any questions, please let me know.
Do some people want to maybe give us some thumbs up or an okay in the chat just to make sure everyone's following? It's going at the right pace for everyone. There's no questions yet, but or none that have been shared yet. Okay, we got an okay from Viva. Okay, no questions. All right.
Cool.
Good.
Rock and roll. Don't worry about it. We can always address them as we go. Okay. So don't hesitate to share them with us.
There's just one question. Do we need to declare let every time?
Yeah, every time you want to declare a variable, you need to use let. Yeah, that's the standard. There's other ways, but for now, as whilst we learn, let's just stick to let. Yeah, everything in lowercase. So yeah.
Right.
Cool. So do you see my slides?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, perfect. So this is what we left it off. Now, let me introduce you to a couple of concepts. So as we saw earlier, what we were storing in each variable. So here, we're just storing one name, right? So Roger, Barcelona, Spain. It was just one element stored in a variable. When you as you continue to progress in your development skills, you will need to be manipulating larger amounts of data, right? So the question that you might think is, hang on a second, Roger. You were telling me earlier about the boxes, right? I get it. So if I have shirts, I can put a shirt in this box. If I have a book, I can put it in the books. But what happens if, and then I put my shoes here, but what happens if instead of one shoe, I want to actually put more shoes in a single box, right? So it's nothing but putting additional multiple values inside one variable, inside one box, right? This is going to be crucial because, as I mentioned earlier, typically when you develop and you program, you're not going to be doing websites just with one name. You're going to be doing it with multiple values, right? And you're going to be wanting to wrap all of them or store all of them in one conceptual variable, right? So shoes in that case. Now JavaScript does that, and there's a way that JavaScript does that, and it does it with what's called an array. Okay, that's A-R-R-A-Y. Now, what's an array? It's effectively a collection of values, of key values that are stored in one of the boxes, right? So a stored collection of key values. Okay. Now I'm going to be breaking down these further, this description in the next slide. But I hope that's understood. The way to store multiple values inside one box is through what's called an array. Okay. So as we saw earlier, here we saw one value, just simply one number stored, right? Or one text stored. But that's definitely not the way forward. As we continue to bench in JavaScript, we want to make sure we store several values. And that's through what's called an array, okay? Now, how do we create an array in JavaScript? Here earlier, and addressing the question that just came up, we declared a variable with let. So just like we did earlier, we use a unique name. So let space shoes space assignment value, right? Remember that this symbol that you see here is not equal, it's assignment. It's effectively saying that you're going to store information in that box, okay? Now, the first thing you do to declare an array is using these square brackets, right? So you put one square bracket at the beginning and one at the end, right? Just two square brackets, right? You might want to look at your keyboard to find them because these are not symbols that you might use for very often, but it's just a square bracket, right? And then in here, you're telling JavaScript, I'm going to be storing multiple values, not just one, okay? And then you just go ahead and you put 3 values. So earlier we had only boots. Now we're going to be putting 2 additional values. Again, as you see, when we put text, you put the double quotes, right? So double quotes, boots, double quotes, same for sneakers and same for sandals, right? So you put 3 elements in it, okay? Now, the way to separate multiple elements, as you notice, is with comma separators, right? So you put a comma separator to separate 2 values. So if there's a square bracket, you don't need to put a comma in it. So that's why you put square bracket, element, comma, element, comma, element, square bracket. So notice that when they call comma separators are to divide 2 different values, okay? Not the value with the square brackets. Okay, so that's why there's no comma, not at the beginning, not at the end, neither at the beginning nor the end. Okay. Any questions thus far?
Nope, no questions, but someone did share that they loved the analogy.
Cool.
Oh, wait. Do you have to use a semicolon when finishing a line of code?
That's something you used to do in JavaScript. You don't have to. The short answer is no. If you want at the end, we can discuss a bit more how it was before and how it is now. But the short answer is no, you don't have to. Not in JavaScript. You don't need to put anything at the end.
And now there's another question which asks, can we store number and strings together in a single array?
Yep. The answer is yes. And we'll see that in the next slide. So yeah, definitely. Okay.
Awesome.
Now.
Oh, wait, one more. What are the uses for the boxes and why would you want to put items in it?
Sorry, what's that again?
What are the uses for the boxes and why would you want to put items in it?
Right, so we'll say it in a second. I'm just gonna walk you through the next slide and then we're gonna do some practical exercise together. You'll see why we need to store the information.
Yeah.
The short answer is because in JavaScript, you're gonna be manipulating a lot of data. So for example, let's assume you have a website where you have 100 customers, right? You're not gonna, and if you create a variable called customers, you cannot store, you need to store multiple people in it, right? So you cannot create 100 variables. So you can just store multiple bits of data into just one variable. It's just so it's easy for you to manipulate. So, but we'll talk more about that in a second. Okay. Now, one piece that is important here, that is implicit in JavaScript. As you see here, all what we've done thus far is written. So you actually wrote about these things, right? And you actually wrote this in CodePen or in whatever program you use to use JavaScript. Now, what JavaScript does automatically, and you don't have to do anything with it, is it assigns a position of each element inside the array. Now, this position in the world of JavaScript is called an index, is an array index. So it's effectively nothing but the position of the element. So the first element in the array goes from left to right is boots, second sneakers, and then sandals, right? The way for JavaScript to understand that is what's called, as I mentioned, through an array index. Now, what's funny is that in the world of programming, the first number is not 1, it's actually 0. And the cause of that is a very long conversation. Just take my word for it for now to understand that when you want to define the first position of an element in an array, you just need to start with 0. Okay. So again, boots is the first element in the array, and the index is 0, right? The second element, sneakers, is the index 1, and so on. Okay. Now that's something that you don't need to worry about. That's something that JavaScript will automatically do. Okay. So let me make sure that we ground up the concept. Some examples. Here, again, same story. I just added another element at the end. This array has 4 elements, but we could put 200 elements. There's no limit to it, right? Always using the same syntax. Know that there's no comma at the beginning or at the end. And we're putting a comma to separate each element, right? And you see how the array index in orange is automatically assigned to each element within the array, right? Here, thus far, we've been storing text. So as someone asked earlier, we can also put numbers, right? So just plain numbers, 50, 301, and so on, just plain numbers. And again, same story happens. So JavaScript will automatically assign an array index to each other, right? So just the position of each element within the array, okay? And then if the array is shorter, imagine you only have 1 element, then you could just see 1 element, and that would be with the array index of 0, okay? Any questions thus far?
Let's see. At the moment, there's nothing, but sometimes they come in. Nope. Oh, all good.
Yeah, perfect. Just reach out, okay? So that's how we create JavaScript variables, right? That's, arrays, right? So now we have that information, right? Now, there's 2 steps to it. Now that I have all these elements stored in a variable, now how do I do things with it? How can I touch these elements? How can I access the values inside it? And it will make more sense when we see it in the practice, but that's how you store information. Now you want to access that information. How to do it? It's easy to access the data inside JavaScript arrays. So here we've got yet another array. Now to access that information, what we do is, remember earlier that to declare a JavaScript variable, we used let space shoes, right? So now we already have this variable. We don't need to create it again. But if we want to access that name, it's as simple as using the variable name, right? So imagine we wanted to access the value sandals, right? Just for example. So what we would do is we would just write the variable name shoes, the same as the array, okay? Note that we're not using let because the variable already exists. We just simply need to call it. We're just simply telling JavaScript, hey, I want to access some information inside that array, okay? To define what element I want, we use the same square brackets again. There's no space here. It's shoes, follow immediately with square brackets, okay? No space in between, just all in one word, okay? And then inside, you guessed it, you can probably guess what we're going to be using, right, to ping the right element. So I'm sure you've guessed it. We just use the index. So in this case, that shoes followed by square brackets and 2 inside it, that would obtain the result of sandals, okay? Just once again, imagine we wanted to get the gym footwear, right? So we wanted to know what's the right footwear to wear in the gym or to get hold of it, right? So again, we would call the variable name shoes, square brackets, no space altogether, 1 space between the 2 brackets, just to make sure that you can place inside the index. And that would return the value sneakers. Everyone with me?
Yep.
Cool. Just to recap, and we'll start doing some funky stuff in a second. Just to recap, we create JavaScript arrays like so, let space shoes, assignment value, square brackets, and then whatever elements that we want. We've seen it can be numbers or text, and then we just put comma separators among them. And to access, that information, we just use variable name, choose square brackets, the index in it, and that will give you the value of that element. Okay. Cool. So I take it there's no questions. I've talked a lot. Now, as I always say in code, don't take my word for it. Let's have a look at it together. And now if we go back to CodePen, to the link that Anna shared in the chat, we're going to start seeing that in action. Okay. I'll just give a second for everybody to return to the screen. Cool. Whilst we all come back.
I'll share the link one more time just in case anyone missed it.
Cool.
All right, there we go. Oh, we have a quick question here. Can we limit the size of arrays?
I don't know the actual answer, what's the limit, but let me tell you, if there's a limit, it must be in the thousands of elements that you can put in an array, or even probably more, but you will never create an array that long, I don't think. Maybe you will, but yeah, I don't think there's a limit as such. Yeah. Cool. So this is the variables that we see earlier. One quick word, I'll just introduce you to a couple of quick things here. You see this button run at the top? Run is a feature of this platform, CodePen, that we use, and is effectively gonna run that script. So what it's gonna be doing is when we do something here, when we make any changes to here, the browser will not know. The browser will only know that there's changes when we click on run. So what we're telling the browser is, hey, I've written a set of JavaScript instructions, go and execute them. JavaScript, do the instruction that I'm giving you here. And then JavaScript is gonna go and execute all of this, okay? So long as we don't click here, nothing happens. So we need to click every time, okay? And one last thing I would like for all of us to try is to write the keyword alert, just like in English, alert. That's A, and you can write it with me here in CodePen. Alert is A-L-E-R-T, okay, A-L-E-R-T, and then brackets, followed, all one word, no space, okay? So I'm gonna do it again. That's A-L-E-R-T, alert, and then brackets. Now notice that in CodePen, you don't need to create one bracket and then the closing one. When you create brackets, it would automatically create both the opening and the closing one. That's because CodePen knows that if you use a bracket symbol is to open it and close it, right? So it will just automatically do it, right? Now, alert is a specific keyword. Remember that we talked about LET being a keyword. So alert is a specific keyword that what it does is it gives instruction to the browser to trigger a pop-up, a screen that contains some information, right? And the information that is going to be displayed in that pop-up is effectively whatever we place in between these two brackets, okay? So here, if I do double quotes and I just click Roger or your name, right? So again, alert, we have this two square brackets, excuse me, the brackets, and then I just do double quote, just like we saw earlier that we create the way to create strings. And you just write down your name inside, Roger. Again, make sure that there's double quotes before and after, right? That's gonna trigger a pop-up, okay? So alert, brackets, double quotes, Roger, double quotes, and then the other bracket, or whatever name you wanna put in, right? And then if you click on run, you will not see it in my screen because of Zoom limitations, but if you click on the run button, after a few seconds, what you'll see is that there's a pop-up that appears in your screen. And the content of that pop-up is effectively whatever you've written in between the brackets, okay? If you've managed to follow me here, just please put on the chat, thumbs up, or good, no questions or anything. If you haven't managed to get that alert, just let me know, okay?
All right, we're getting lots of okays and goods and all good.
Cool. Perfect. I really want to make sure you got it because of Zoom limitations, you cannot see the pop-up, but trust me, I'm seeing my pop-up and I'm sure you can as well. So cool. So we've seen this far. Let's go and delete this now. And just delete all of that. Okay. And now that we've seen arrays, let's create an array called contacts. Right. So one array called contacts. So let's do it together. Remember to create an array, you use LET space contacts, just like the English word contacts. So CONTACTS. Yeah. So LET space contacts space assignment value, right? we're telling JavaScript we're going to store something in that variable, right? And then if you remember how to create a variable, how to define an array in JavaScript, we use the square brackets, right? So again, as it happened,
there's a question. Maybe
yeah.
we can. Is there a reason you have started the line code, the line of code on line 16 instead of 15?
No, it's a good question. No, it makes no difference. It's just so it's not all jammed together, so it's easier to read. But you could perfectly be writing this here, and it would make no difference. Yeah.
All right. There's one more question, but maybe we can touch upon it later. I'll just mention it now, and maybe we can touch upon it. It says regarding arrays, how to add more values to an array which is already defined, or delete a value in an array which is already defined.
Right. That's a good question. There's definitely some magic that you can do it. For now, it's probably something we can discuss it a bit later at the end. Yeah. Okay. But there's definitely ways. So cool. So let's create this array. And in this array, I would like for you to please add the names of 3 people that are friends of yours that you know, or just 3 names in general, right? Let's put 3 of them for starters. As we mentioned earlier, every element needs to be followed by a comma, right, to separate it. So here I'm going to put Ruth. I'm going to put an example. Again, I'm putting the double quote, right? Then comma. Notice I'm putting a comma. Then I'll put another one, 2 double quotes, and I'm going to put Roger as an example. Comma. Then I'm going to put another one that is Kieran. Again, you can put whatever names that you want. It doesn't really matter. And we'll have here now 3 names. So again, comma only to separate the names, the 2 names, right? No comma necessarily at the beginning or the end. Okay. With that, we have an array, right? Now, how do we access the information here? How do we see that information here, right? So as we saw earlier, we can do contacts, right? So we just call the variable name. We don't need to create a variable again. We just call contacts, right? And then assignment, square brackets, and then the index, right? So to make it easy, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put this double dash. This is just a comment. So this is just a comment. I can write anything I want here. So what I'm going to write is, I'm going to do a little trick. I'm going to put here, what as you remember earlier is the index, right? So to access this information, I'm simply going to be using these indexes here, right? Again, this is just a comment. So it's only here to help us, right? So, but here, as you saw, here I just put the index. So for example, if I wanted to access Ruth, I would only put the index 0, right? Now, this element here is floating. If we need to store it somewhere, because we cannot just have here a name floating, right? JavaScript doesn't understand that here. So what we're going to do is, because we know how to create variables, we're going to create a variable called friend, and we're going to store that information inside. So instead of having it here floating, what we're going to do is we're going to kill a variable called friend, so L-E-T space friend, just like the English word, F-R-I-E-N-D space Simon, and then what we're going to do is we're going to put this up here in the same line, okay? And that's storing the first element of this array, or let's say if you want the last one, doesn't really matter, whatever name you put, inside this this variable. Oops, sorry, just displayed here, they are printed. Okay, now let's have a look at what that information, that box includes, and we can do it with the command that we saw earlier, right? So alert. So if we see alert, A-L-E-R-T, brackets, right? And remember earlier that you put your name, we put your name here. Now we don't want to put a name. What we want to put here is we can put the name of the variable, right? So here's what you see an example of why do you want to use variables? Because you store information and then you can reutilize and manipulate that data, right? So instead of writing our name, we're going to delete everything. So there's only alert brackets. And inside, we're going to write the name of the variable. So friend in this case, right? F-R-I-E-N-D, right? So again, just to recap, we created this variable with an array. It has 3 elements in it. Then what we're doing is we created a second a variable called friend. And inside that variable, we stored the first element of this array, because we put the index 0, so that would store this value in the variable array, friend, right? And now we want to see what's on it. So with the alert command, what we do is we click on run, and if you now click on run, you should be able to see the text that you've stored or the data that you've stored in the first array, in the first element of the array. Okay? Cool. If anyone did not get that or hasn't managed to get the right information, just give us a shout in the chat and we'll be able to help.
We have a quick question from before, which was, may I create a list of variables on the array?
Huh, that's a good question. Do you want to answer it, Anna?
Yeah. Yes, you can include variables, I think, within an array. If I remember correctly, yes.
Yes, you can. So let's do it for example. This is a bit more advanced, but I'm happy for us to do it. You see here that I wrote the name Roger, right? But guess what? I already have Roger here, right? In line 6, I already have Roger in it, right? So what I can do is, if I delete this here, right? And I just write down the name of that variable, which is name in this case, right? I should be storing that information here. Now, as I always say in code, don't take my word for it. Let's have a look. So we want to see what information is in here. Let's change the index. So instead of 0, we put it 1, right? So now we're pointing to the second variable or whatever variable that you wrote. So just delete one of the elements inside your index and replace it with a variable name, for example. And then just change the index so it points there, right? So you have the index 1. And then if you run this, you should be able to see the information stored in it. So if you run this now in your pop-up, you should be able to see the value Roger if you change the right index and you replace the element in your array. Everyone with me?
Yep.
Cool. Another element that is a bit more advanced and it's quite interesting. Imagine now for a second that I'm going to replace this. I'm going to put a regular name so it's easier, Roger. Now, imagine I wanted to get the last element of the array, right? One way to do it is easy. I can just simply change the index as we saw. And if I just change this to 2, then that would return to me the last value, right? But let me tell you something. What if now all of a sudden, as someone mentioned, we add another value here? So right now we've got these 3 elements. If I run this, I would be getting, in my case, the element Kieran, right? Which is the last element. But what if all of a sudden, here at the beginning, I add another element? So I'm going to add a comma, make sure I separate the element, 2 double quotes, and then I'm going to put Anna here at the beginning, right? If I run this code, and if you do it yourself, if you run it, you'll see that all of a sudden you're not getting the last element anymore because the index 2 is now pointing to the element Roger, not the last element, right? Now, obviously, that's because you've changed. The elements in the array, right? One way to solve this in a more dynamic way is through a specific magic power, so to speak, that JavaScript gives to arrays, right? So remember earlier that we talked about how JavaScript magically and automatically creates or gives an array index to each of these elements. JavaScript does something else. The moment you create an array, this variable has another magical power. And this magical power is what's called an attribute or a property, right? Now, this is nothing but an extra magical power that can give me the length of that. So it's effectively an automatic way that JavaScript can use to tell you how many elements you find inside that array, right? So all of a sudden, what I can see automatically is I don't need to count each element, right? What I can do is instead, I can know all the elements. So let's try it out together. Let's create a variable called length, right? So like the English word, L-E-T space L-E-N-G-T-H, right? Length. Oops, excuse me. L-E-N-G-H-T, right? Length. And then inside, what we're going to put is context. And you'll say, hang on a second, Roger, where is the element here? We're just storing the whole array, right? Here's where the magic comes. If you just do context dot with no space, length, like the English word, right? And make sure you don't misspell it.
Wait, careful, Roger. You might the T.
I misspell it. Yeah, I misspell it. So that's why you don't want to misspell it. Otherwise, you wouldn't work, right? So Length. Right?
That's an example of pair programming, people.
That's an example of pair programming. I don't know if there are any questions, Anna.
We have one, but I was gonna wait for it later because I think you're about to. It was, can I store values as contacts and then brackets 0 equals tiger? I think this is in terms of adding new variables, which you just did, really, but
yeah, we'll talk about that at the end if that's okay. But yes, you can. Yeah, you can store more elements in it. Yeah. So what we have here, and make sure to either two things: you don't spell it wrong, or you have Anna with you that can just help you make sure that she picks up on the spelling mistakes. So right now here, what we have is the length, the number of elements, right? So as I always say in code, don't take my word for it, just have a look. So now, if I instead of alert, if instead of seeing friend, I put length, right? So I just replace that here, and I click run. What you'll see in here is the number of elements inside that array, right? So you should see a 4. In my case, I see a 4 because there's 4 elements, right? So Anna, Ruth, Roger, and Kieran, these 4 elements inside the array. Now, why is that useful? Because all of a sudden, instead of me necessarily needing to change these each time, I can use this number because this is a dynamic field, right? So it means that if I put 10 elements more, these will be automatically changed. It will just simply calculate each time the number of elements in it, right? So this is a number that you can manipulate. So for example, if you do context.length minus 1, and that's just a fixed value that you give, that's gonna, what you're storing inside that variable is actually the result of that operation. That just like in mathematics, when you subtract one number from another, right? So if you just do context.length minus 1, and you store that in the variable length, then, and you run this again, you'll see that this variable, the variable length, stores the result of the context length, which was 4 in my case, minus 1, which is 3, right? Why is this cool? Because all of a sudden here, I have the last index of the variable, right? I've got a 3 stored here, right? So right now here, instead of writing this number, I can put a 3, but 3 is stored in this variable, right? Let me do one thing. Let me just move all of these above. Nothing changes. I've simply moved this variable above, right? Just so it's clear, right? So I have the array length, which is here, which in my case is 4, and then I'm deducting 1, just an arbitrary figure. And that's all of a sudden, length, as we saw, is 3, which is effectively the number I'm after here, right? So remember earlier that I told you that between these square brackets, you had to put a number? I was actually only telling you the half truth. Yes, it's true that you had to put a number, but you can put the number directly, or you can actually put a variable name that has a value stored in it. So you guessed it. If I want to put a 3 here, but dynamically, in this case, I can just write down length, Length, because as we saw, this is just nothing but a number, right? It's just a 3. So I can put this here, and JavaScript will understand that what you're putting in these square brackets is actually a 3, right? And you know it. Don't take my word for it. Let's try it out and see. Now, instead of length, if I delete that and I want to see what's inside friend, just write here friend, F-R-I-E-N. And then if you run that, you should be able to see the last number. Excuse me, the last item in your array, which in my case is Kieran. Okay, any questions on that? Whilst I'll give you a few seconds to write down a few questions that you have. In the meantime, I'm just going to repeat what happened here again. Okay, we created an array with 4 elements. We know the index of all of these elements, right? Then, because thanks to the magical powers that JavaScript gives to an array, we know that the variable context has a magical power called length, right? Which counts the number of items inside the array. In this case, is 4. And then of that number, I subtract 1, an arbitrary figure, right? And I store the result of that calculation. I store it in a variable called length, right? Which is nothing but a 3. This, in my case, is 4 minus 1, which is 3. Okay, so length here is, I don't know why I see this screening. Anna, do you see this blue thing?
We can see a little squiggly line. I don't know why that's
I don't know why that is, I have to say, but
It's
that's
quite
interesting.
artistic.
Should I stop sharing and share it again?
You can try. Maybe that would.
1 second, just give me a second. I honestly don't know why that was happening.
Okay, it's gone.
It's gone? Okay.
Yeah.
Speaking about magical powers of JavaScript, huh? So there you have it. I think that was one of my applications that I just was playing up. So cool. So here you should see, as we said here, the variable length has 4, which is the number of items here, minus 1, which is effectively 3, right? And then these 3, which is stored in this variable, I'm simply putting it here. So instead of writing 3, just putting length here, right? So any questions thus far?
For now, nobody's submitting any questions.
Cool, perfect. Now, to answer some of the questions, I think there's a question now. No, perfect. So that's pretty much the reason why we do things like that, and answering a question that we were posed earlier about why do we want to store information here in the first place, right? Let me show you an example. Let's remove this here, alert, remove it, right? Everything is gone. The last thing you should have is friend here, the variable friend with one element of the array context stored in it, right? Now, remember earlier that we scroll down is our website. You want to scroll up again, right? That's the result of our website, right? And line reads, "Hi, my name is Sarah, and this is an image of one of my favorite countries," right? We can scroll that again. Right? Now, what I would like for you to do is to scroll down in JavaScript, and if you go to a line 49 or 50 or so, you should see a line of JavaScript that was already there, right? And you'll see that the first element, the two symbols at the beginning of that sentence is the double dash, right? So what I would like for you to do is to simply delete those two elements. So you see here, and the sentence is now in gray, right? So I would like for you to delete those two elements, 1, 2, right? You should see that the sentence changes color. It's no longer gray. And then instead of, and the first word that you should have is document, right? So again, I'm just gonna delete 1 and 2, right? When everybody has that, then let's scroll up again. And then if you scroll that up, and then if you run this code, what you should be able to see is effectively in this sentence, you should be able to see the name that you've pulled out of your array, right? So that's an example. This is what's called DOM manipulation, but that's an example of why variables and arrays are so important, because it's with this information that you're going to be storing and manipulating that you're actually going to be changing your website, right? So all of a sudden, if I change this here, instead of length, I change it to a 2, and I run this again, then you'll have that automatically changed, right? So this is an example of that. It could be, for example, imagine you want to create a personalized invitation to all your friends and you've got their names. You don't need to create a website for each of your friends. You can just do an automated a single website where you have a placeholder, and then effectively you send it to all your friends, and depending on the name of your friend, he or she will see that in the title, right? So that's a bit what I wanted to cover for today's webinar. There's many more things that we could delve into, and we'll be doing so in subsequent JavaScript webinars. But I don't know if there's any questions at this stage on what we've seen thus far. Don't bang your heads on the wall and understanding what happens here. I'll explain that in subsequent webinars. But for now, just hopefully you can understand what has happened here. There's a line of code that has used the value that we stored, and has effectively changed it in the website. Okay. Let me go back to the slides. Just want to show you one last thing, just to show you what we've seen thus far, okay, or what we've seen today. We have understood the concept of array, as we saw earlier. You're now able to create arrays. You're now able to read values stored in arrays. And also you have understood the length property. And now you also see the symbols that, honestly, I don't know what my application is doing, but I'm just going to stop share and share again because it seems to be fixing it. So, so we've understood the array concept. We've created arrays, read values stored in arrays, the length property, and also some basic examples of hard coding patterns. So what's a hard coding pattern? In this code that you saw earlier, you saw that by virtue of using the length property, right? we can have dynamic code. Means that if you add more values, this is just going to be adjusting, right? It's not hard coded. Hard coded is effectively when you just put a number here, and if you keep adding more elements, that will effectively break your code because you will not be retrieving the last element, right? So if you ever talk to a developer and he or she tells you, sorry, I cannot change that because it's hard coded, you'll understand what he or she meant in that sense. It's a functionality that cannot be manipulated. You told me a set of instructions, you told me your array had 4 elements and you wanted the last element. I just coded in a way that always retrieves the last element, but there's no two ways about it, right? So that's an example of a hard coding pattern, okay? So the first thing I want to say is good job, all of you. I know it's been quite intense and quite a few elements. I would suggest for you to make sure you ground those concepts and you know, you sort of go through them, those concepts again and again. Feel free to play with that code, and as you continue to learn JavaScript, you know, we together with our webinars, we're going to go into much more detail, but there's a very good foundation for you to start playing with code. And as I always say, when it comes to learning code, please do break things. Nothing happens when it comes to JavaScript. Just try new things and let your imagination fly as you continue learning JavaScript. Okay? So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover for today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier, we'll have some time now if there's any questions that any of you wanted to put forward to us.